Welcome to The Real News. I'm Jessel Noor with an update on the wave of teacher wildcat strikes that began in West Virginia and have spread across the country. In places like Arizona, Kentucky, and Oklahoma, where the teachers' union is calling for the end of the 2-week walkout after the state's Republican-dominated legislature passed its first major tax hikes in decades, raising about $450 million for education. But the teachers were demanding $600 million. Oklahoma Education Association President Alicia Priest.
This fight is not over just because the school bell will ring once more. We have created a movement, and there is no stopping us.
Priest says the union will continue to push for more funding in Oklahoma, where teacher salaries are among the lowest in the country, averaging just $42,000 a year. Classes are expected to resume on Monday. In Arizona, the Republican governor has agreed to a 20% pay raise for teachers by 2020, but educators are saying that's not enough. And in Kentucky, teachers are rallying at the Capitol today and tomorrow, despite threats from the governor, to protest a number of bills, including cuts to their pension, which was just signed into law, and tax cuts for the wealthy, and inadequate funding for education. According to the nonpartisan Center for Budget Priorities, the tax cuts, backed by powerful interests like the Koch brothers, have shrunk state revenues, squeezing state general fund dollars, which means there's less money to fund education. Not only has the average teacher salary fallen nearly 10% in Arizona and 15% in Oklahoma since 2010, the states face obstacles in raising revenues to address these problems. Well, now joining us to discuss this is Tithi Bhattacharya, a national organizer for the International Women's Strike who writes widely on feminist issues, teaches South Asian history at Purdue University. She recently visited Kentucky and wrote the piece, Women Are Leading the Wave of Strikes in America. Here's why. Thank you so much for joining us. And can you just talk about your reaction to some of the latest news that's coming in from these states where we've seen these red states where we've seen these unprecedented strikes demanding more pay, more funding for education, and to secure things like pensions, as well as protesting the spread of privatized charter schools?
First of all, thank you, Jaisal, for having me here. It has been one of the greatest experiences in my life in the last few weeks to talk to these striking teachers from Oklahoma, Arizona, West Virginia, and Kentucky. I was in West Virginia and I was just in Kentucky talking to teachers. So I guess I have three things to say really about this. One is that this is the first time in many, many years that we are seeing a rank and file surge of activity of ordinary workers in this particular sector, despite the often cautious approach and sometimes actually negative approach of their union leaders. So in West Virginia, the teachers defied their unions when they said, oh, we've gotten enough, let's go back to work. The teachers said, no, we are here for our health benefits and we want to see that sorted. In Oklahoma, a similar thing is happening. In Kentucky in particular, the teachers feel that the union just hasn't, the union officials, these are union teachers, they're all in the union and they back the union, but they feel that the union leadership has not done enough. So we're seeing the emergence, hopefully, of a new rank and file organizing, political organizing of rank and file workers that is increasingly beginning to reject the business unionism that has held sway in the labor movement in this country for a very long time. The second, I think, is the sort of neoliberal consensus on cutting funding for all public services, teaching and healthcare being most prominent, is finally being challenged by ordinary people whose lives are most affected by these cuts. So that's a simultaneous development that is happening. So these movements are not just against the union officials, they're also against this entrenched neoliberal consensus of cuts to public services and particularly public education. So they're definitely fighting on two very, very major fronts, because in a lot of cases, the neoliberal cuts to education and health is a bipartisan deal. You know, both Republicans and Democrats are involved in this. And for instance, in 2012, the Chicago Teachers Union went on this brilliant strike, and that was against the policies affected by their Democrat mayor, Rahm Emanuel. So, I mean, it's a very, very bipartisan consensus to cut public funding. So that's the second thing. And I think thirdly, there is the immense pressure now from the corporate class. Having seen this kind of new upsurge developing, there is a panic in the corporate class and a conscious effort to try and basically kill it at its very inception and nip it in the bud. I know many of you have seen the recent Guardian article of this new this new network that has come together, which is called the State Policy Network, and it encompasses 66 right-wing think tanks who are basically creating a manual of how to talk about teachers' strikes by sort of calling or basically showing the teachers as being greedy and not responsive or not caring enough about the welfare of their children in their classrooms. And this is how this is going to affect the poorest of families. This is such a nefarious step forward, because I hope we get a chance to talk about this, how the entire, and this is what I wrote in my Guardian article as well, all of these strikes, which are 75% female teachers, these are not just teachers in the classrooms. Some of them are mothers, and their children are in these classrooms too. But the primary focus of the teachers, as well as the parents who are supporting the strike, is we need to hold on for our students. The reason we're striking is because it is not so much our pensions we care about. We do care about our pensions, but we care about the future of public education, and we care about our students. 90% of teachers that I have spoken with, Jaisal, and you will find this experience nationally, did not come into this profession of public school teaching to make a lot of money. These are not Betsy DeVos's cousins. They came to this profession because they believe in a public good and they love to teach young people. That's basically it. You know, in classroom after classroom in Kentucky and West Virginia, I have seen how they interact with their own students and how this is reciprocated by the students by going all out in supporting their teachers in this strike. You know, and students have marched in West Virginia in support of the teachers. They have come to picket lines in Arizona, in Kentucky. They're constantly writing messages to the teachers that, you know, miss, we need you to hold on because you're fighting for me, and my mom and dad support you. It's an extraordinary level of support for teachers. And in that context, for this right-wing Koch brothers funded sort of institute to come together to undermine them is both ridiculous, but also should be taken very, very seriously because they have so much money to advertise this.
Does that show the real power of these teachers? Because they are, you know, they are putting the most powerful, most connected. You mentioned the Koch brothers back then, but so does the DeVos family, the Amway from the Amway fortune. You know, the current Secretary of Education who spent millions of dollars funding these similar policies around the country. And, you know, I keep going back to the 60 Minutes interview where Leslie Stahl was able just to ask, you know, Betsy DeVos, like, look, these policies have been disastrous where they've been implemented in your own state. And yet, you know, these same policies continue, as you mentioned, to be pushed, you know, across the country by Democrats and Republicans, this neoliberal consensus. You know, I wanted to ask you, so now unions in many of these states now have called off these strikes and said, look, we need to go to the ballot box. We need to go and vote out these, you know, these candidates and vote in our own candidates that actually support public education. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that that is an effective strategy, or the grassroots pressure needs to be maintained through these protests?
A lot of these teachers are traditionally Republican voters. In West Virginia, some of the most radical teachers I spoke with who were demanding that the gas companies be funded to fund public education were saying the most beautiful things about why public education needed to be funded were Republican voters. So for them, voting for Democrats is actually a very, very big step. And they see that as a movement towards the left, towards progressive policies, right? So this is very different from the experience of sort of blue states and, large sections of the left who have a different assessment of the Democrats. But many teachers in the red state do not. And I think we need to respect the process of politicization of this generation of class fighters at the moment, right? Having said that, I would also say that, as I said before, the neoliberal consensus is bipartisan, and one of the tragedies of the labor movement in this country is we do not have an independent Labor Party that can actually advocate for the real needs of the teachers, because all the union bureaucrats who are basically in state after state calling off militant action by the grassroots are all Democrat Party voters. And this is why, and they're Democratic Party members. They raise funds for the organization, for the party, and they're very, very clearly sort of advocates for the party rather than being advocates for their own membership. So obviously the threat from real grassroots actions is a real threat to also the official union bureaucracy, because it means less of a hold on their members. And so they're trying to diffuse it in all cases, as they did in the right to work struggles that went on in Wisconsin, which also, you remember, the teachers led it by occupying the state house. And in every instance, the union took the militant action, supported it to a certain level, and then abandoned it to say, okay, either we can't get what we want, or we've gotten enough, so let's step back and we will vote them out in November. Now, you talked about Betsy DeVos. The union bureaucracy may have realized this or may not. I can't speak for them. But there is a pattern here in all the concessions, so-called, that the governors have given to these strikes, okay? And the pattern is to give in to some immediate demands of the teachers, but consciously block long-term funding for public education. So this is, you will see this in a pattern. This is what I want to write about, that this is a very clear strategy. Oh my gosh, you're striking. We just need to kind of put a safety valve on it and get some of that steam out, but we will continue on our path of defunding public education and putting the voucher system in and the charter schools in. So if you see in West Virginia, they have said very clearly that they're going to get a committee to discuss healthcare, right? A committee. So that was what, I mean, they won the 5% raise, which was fantastic, but their big thing was their healthcare system, where their deductibles were raised 500% in the last few years, and they wanted that sorted, and they didn't get that fully funded healthcare system with different revenue stream. They did not get that, but what they did get, which was great, was a committee to discuss this in the future. Now, here's the question. Which new teacher is going to enlist in the West Virginia school system unless their health care is guaranteed, right? So that is one of the great things that the union movement in the past have won for public sector workers, you know, that your pension, your health care will be taken care of because you serve the public good for your entire life. And those are being attacked. So that's what makes future teachers joining the movement very precarious, right? Similarly, in Kentucky, the union leadership, the bill passed after their first sick out. The politicians passed the bill which said that pensions would not be attacked for retired teachers, those that are already retired, and the present day teachers, okay? And the rank and file teachers are rightly disgusted by this because they said, we're not in this just for us. Yes, our pensions are taken care of. However, why should new people apply for these jobs if their pensions are completely insecure? So this is a sort of long-term goal to starve the public sector, education in the public sector, and discourage people from becoming teachers. So when this sort of generation of teachers retire, it'll be a charter school carnival, right? The same in Oklahoma. In Oklahoma, it is exactly the same, where they got a raise for $6,000, but the militants are rightly pointing out that this is just for this year. There is no guarantee for next year. Again, it's like, we'll give you some scraps from the table so that you go home happy, but the future still remains uncertain, both your own futures as well as the future of public education in general.
Well, thank you so much for joining me, and I think it's important to always remind people that this is the same playbook that really, it started, when the New Deal was passed, but then especially after Brown versus Board of Education, when conservatives, would not accept the idea that tax dollars would go to fund public education for African American students, and so they developed this playbook on how to defund and voucherize, public schools, and then, of course, that's not the only institution, but that is one of the first institutions, and because it's dominated by women who make less money, it's an easy target for these billionaires and millionaires who are able to cut that to balance the budget in times, in lean times, and that money has not been restored in these states now where you're seeing this unrest and these teachers mobilizing. So we're going to certainly keep following the story. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Jaisal.
Thank you for watching The Real News Network.